In the 1940s, a man by the name of Ollie Roberts caused a bit of a stir, caught some attention, when after consultation with his attorney, he outed himself as Brushy Bill Roberts. Now, that in and of itself probably wouldn't have caused much of a stir, but Mr. Roberts continued on and made the claim that Brushy Bill Roberts was, in fact, William H. Bonney, better known as Old West outlaw Billy the Kid. He came to his attorney with a request. Mr. Roberts wanted an audience with the governor of New Mexico so that he could receive the pardon that had been promised to and later retracted for Billy the Kid. You see, history says that Billy the Kid was shot dead by Sheriff Pat Garrett in 1881. And so when he showed up in the 1940s, you can imagine it caught some people by surprise. Shortly after Garrett shot Billy the Kid, word began to spread of speculation that Garrett had in fact killed the wrong man and that Billy the Kid had escaped. And so Mr. Brushy Bill Roberts got his audience before the governor. And despite testimony from people who had been personally acquainted with William H. Bonney, the governor found the evidence uncompelling. And so he denied the request for the long-standing pardon. Ollie Roberts would die 4 weeks later. And subsequent inquiries into his identity have proven to be inconclusive. Through some twists and turns of history, the original gravesite of Billy the Kid was washed away in a flood, and so efforts to trace exactly what may have happened have fallen short. The truth was lost to history. But as you might imagine, that didn't stop Hollywood. Can't let truth or history get in the way of a good story, right? And so, it came time to create a sequel to the 1988 Brat Pack Western classic Young Guns. Young Guns 2 opens with one Brushy Bill Roberts meeting along a roadside on horseback with his attorney, making the claim that he is Billy the Kid. The attorney, as you might imagine, was a bit skeptical and told the man so. He said, this is unbelievable. But before completely discounting him, the attorney asked Mr. Roberts, "Can you give me some evidence? Scars or something? Do you have any scars?" The movie then unfolds in flashback over a great soundtrack by Bon Jovi, by the way. Because it's, the late 80s, early 90s. You can mix Wild West Cowboys and, stadium rock. It works. But the story is told in flashback, leading all the way up to the encounter between Billy the Kid and Sheriff Pat Garrett, where Kid was assumed shot dead. The film then reverts back. Spoiler alert, it's been like 30 years, so I feel like it's fair game, okay? The film ends, however, flashing back to the present, the 1940s. hear Brushy Bill Roberts say to his attorney, "You ask me if I have any scars." Yes, sir, I have my scars. And then, as any good cowboy would do, he rides off into the sunset, leaving the question of his identity unsolved for us all. Do you have any scars? It seems like an odd question. So why ask that question in that moment? It's because scars leave a mark. Scars tell a story. They are the unique imprint of the traumas that we endure. And so, they can become marks of identity. Right? We all have scars. No doubt you have scars. Maybe one of your scars is from that epic bike wreck that you had when you and your brother decided to try to Evel Knievel across the creek the summer you turned 14. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Maybe your scars are from that Thanksgiving that you were trying to quickly and hurriedly finish chopping the potatoes before your mother-in-law arrived, and you accidentally laid the side of your hand open and got to spend the holiday at urgent care. Maybe your scars are from the heart surgery that saved your life. We all have scars. And as I'm sure that you would acknowledge, not every scar is necessarily visible. There are some wounds, some traumas that we endure that definitely leave a mark. They leave a scar on the story of our lives, scars that will never be seen with the physical eye. And so that's why we've titled this conversation that we'll be having together over the next few weeks as Scars, Heartbreak, Flesh Wounds, and Other Things That Leave a Mark. Because whether your scars are visible or not, every scar tells a story. And so together over the next few weeks, we want to explore the stories that those scars tell and ask, what will our scars say about us? The big idea we want to spend some time talking about over the next few weeks, it's there in the teaching notes. If you open up the YouVersion Bible app, if you have that on your phone, you can find all of this in the events tab. We'll have it on the screen for you, but if you want to follow along and fill in some blanks in YouVersion, that will be there for you. This big idea we want to tackle together over the next few weeks goes like this. Scars mark our present reality by our past experience. The body can heal, but it doesn't forget. Scars mark our present reality by our past experience. The body can heal, but it doesn't easily forget. And so these lasting marks, these scars, become evidence of the life that we have lived. They become evidence of the traumas that we have endured, the things that we have overcome, and the things that almost overcame us. And scars can easily then become the identifying marks of who we are. Every scar tells a story. What will yours say? And more importantly, as we'll discover over the next few weeks together, will you allow those scars to define your life? To define your identity? Or will you find healing in the hands of a Heavenly Father who loves you? It's said that at his death, The brushy Bill Roberts' body showed scars of 26 different gunshot and knife wounds. Now, that certainly doesn't prove his story, but it does lend an air of credibility, despite the other reasons why we might remain skeptical. There seems to be a gap in years, and it's a fascinating little tale. If you want to do a dive on the rabbit hole that is the internet, you can find out a whole bunch of more stuff. I'm not convinced, for what it's worth. But those scars seem to back up the story just a little bit. And the enduring role that scars play as identifiable evidence, it comes into play for us in the New Testament, particularly in the Gospel of John. As he is winding down his story of Jesus' life, we find this moment where scars as an enduring mark of identity play a central role in John's telling of Jesus' life. You see, Jesus of Nazareth had been crucified and confirmed dead by the Romans. He had been buried. But then stories began to circulate that he was appearing to his disciples, raised to new life. The New Testament contains 4 gospel accounts that tell the story of Jesus' life and ministry. And all of the Gospels point in the same direction. That very early in the morning on the first day of the week, it was a group of women, followers of Jesus, who made their way to the tomb. And they went there specifically to finish preparing Jesus' body for burial. Jesus had been crucified and died late in the day on Friday. And so they had allowed his body to rest on the Jewish Sabbath. He had hurriedly been buried so as to not break any Sabbath customs. And so now, with the sun rising, with the Sabbath passing, the women made their way to the tomb to finish honoring Jesus' body for burial. But when they arrived, the stone that would have been rolled in front of the tomb blocking the entrance had been removed, and they were met with angelic messengers who said, "I know why you are here. You have come seeking Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He is risen, just as he said." The women, at the angel's prompting, hurry back to Jesus' disciples to tell them what has happened. And the Gospels agree that when the women provided their testimony that Jesus was no longer in the tomb, the disciples did not believe them. In fact, John tells us that 2 of the disciples, Peter and presumably John himself, made their way to the tomb to see the evidence for themselves. John says, when they saw that the tomb was empty, they went away, wondering to themselves what had happened. And then John tells us what happened that first Easter evening. I invite you to turn with me to John chapter 20. If you have a Bible with you, click on a device. If you got it on your phone or a tablet, John chapter 20. We'll also have this on the screen for you as well as in YouVersion. John chapter 20, we want to begin in verse 19 where we read this. On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together with the doors locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and side, and the disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Jesus appears to the disciples who are huddled together in fear, a fear that those same Jewish authorities that had put Jesus to trial, had been behind his execution by the Romans, would soon be looking for them as well. And as they're huddled together, Jesus comes and stands in their midst. And he shows them his hands. He shows them his side. And the disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. So why is it that Jesus chose in this moment to show his disciples his hands, to show them his side? Because scars leave a mark. And every scar tells a story. They are the imprint of the traumas that we endure. And so Jesus shows them his hands. He shows them his side, so that they could know with this evidence, this same Jesus who was crucified had been raised to new life. John, however, continues the story. Let's pick it back up in verse 24. Now Thomas, called Didymus, or the twin, one of the 12, was not with the other disciples when Jesus came. And so the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were, unless I put my hand into his side, will not believe it." So a week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. And though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands? Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." And then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." So Thomas apparently missed the meeting Easter night. But we're not told where he was or why he wasn't with the other disciples. We're merely told that Thomas was not with them when Jesus came and stood in their midst. And this scene is brief, but it's layered with meaning for us that we want to spend some time walking through together as we explore this idea of our own scars. If you have ever heard the phrase someone referred to as a doubting Thomas because they're skeptical by nature, this is, of course, where that comes from. In part because Thomas's denial here is as strong as it can be. We don't get the full force of it, but essentially Thomas says, "Unless I touch his scars, I will never believe what you have said." His denial is as strong as it can be stated. He wants to go a step beyond what the other disciples received that first Easter night. They had seen the risen Lord. They had seen his hands. Jesus had showed them his side. Thomas wants to touch them. He needs more than just visual evidence, he claims. Further complicating Thomas's role in this story is the way that John has talked throughout his gospel about signs and the role that they play in people coming to faith. All the way back in John chapter 4, A man comes to Jesus and he says, "Teacher, heal my son. He's laying at home about to die." And Jesus, a little bit out of left field, replies this way. He says, "You people, unless you see a sign, you just won't believe, will you?" Now Jesus goes on to continue to speak to this father, and he says, "Your son has been healed. Go home." And the man returns home, and he speaks to his servants, and he finds that his son was raised up and brought to health at the very moment that Jesus said, "Your son is well." He got his sign. But it doesn't seem as if Jesus is all that happy with that. Throughout John's gospel, there's this thing that hangs over it, that Jesus is stepping into this world to communicate the truth of who he is, and people continually refuse to believe it unless he will do something to prove it, some miracle that will prove the claims he's making to be the Son of God. And so this idea casts a long shadow over John's gospel. And here, after the resurrection, we find Thomas in the camp of people who says, "Unless I see a sign, unless you prove this with some miracle, I'm not going to believe it." Now, to be fair, he's not the only one that doubts, right? Like, the Gospels are pretty united on this. When the women come to the disciples and say, "We've seen the Lord, he is not in the tomb," they all go, "Silly women, what are you thinking?" And they dismiss the testimony out of hand. It's not until Jesus comes and stands in their midst and says, "Peace be with you," and he shows them his hands and he shows them his side, that they believe. And so sometimes we can be a little bit hard on Thomas, but Thomas's doubt isn't special. It's typical. It's something all of us should probably be able to relate to and resonate with, because if there's anything you and I know, I don't think anybody's going to question this, if there's anything we know, it's that people who die tend to stay dead. And so if there is an exception to that rule, it's probably okay to ask for some evidence. For Thomas to say, no. Unless I see him, unless I touch him, I want to feel the scars before I will believe. And so a week later, John tells us we're back to Sunday. We're back to Resurrection Day. And presumably, from what he tells us in his telling of events here, Jesus has not appeared to his disciples since the prior Sunday night. He appears to them that first Easter evening, and then all of a sudden we're back to Sunday, and it seems that Jesus has not been around the disciples all that much. And they gathered again in the upper room, and this time, Thomas is with them. And you'll note that the doors are still locked. They're still huddled in fear, because Jesus was crucified as a rebel king, something that empires don't take kindly to. And so they would expect that his followers would continue to try to rise up. And so his disciples are still huddled in fear. Thomas is in tow when Jesus again stands in their midst and says, "Peace be with you." And after he greets them as a group, Jesus turns specifically to Thomas. He says, "Thomas, see my hands? Come, put your finger in the holes where the nails were. Thomas, would you would you like to put your hand in my side? And Thomas responds, not in the way we might expect, right? Based on what we know about Thomas up to this point and what he had said a week earlier, we would expect him to go, all right, let's see him. But he doesn't do that. He cries out, my Lord and my God. And by doing so, Thomas is borrowing language from the Old Testament. He's taking the two quintessential titles for Yahweh, the great I am, the God of Israel. It says, that is who you are, my Lord and my God. Jesus' scars lent the evidence necessary for Thomas to see his identity. Because our scars leave a mark. Our scars tell a story. And Jesus blesses Thomas for his faith. But he then points forward. Let's finish out the chapter in verses 30 and 31. This is how John recaps the scene for us. Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these things are written, that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Jesus blesses Thomas for his profession of faith. But then Jesus points forward to our experience, those who are not afforded the opportunity to see, but are still invited to believe. He says, Thomas, you're blessed, but more blessed are those who don't see and yet still believe. You see, John is bringing us to this understanding that Jesus once and for all rose from the dead to pay the penalty for sin, to conquer the hold that death has on humanity and promise us new life. And it communicates it with Jesus' scars. There in the teaching notes, if you want to jot it down. You see, when we encounter the scars of Jesus, we must decide if we will trust him to heal our own. And when we come into these moments and we encounter the scars of Jesus, the nail holes in his hands, the hole in his side pierced through by a Roman spear. When we encounter the scars of Jesus, we then have to decide if we will trust him to heal the scars we carry. If he is who he says he is, if he is trustworthy enough that we can believe him to heal what hurts us. Because we all have scars. Some of the scars we have are from our own mistakes. Some of the scars we carry are because someone else hurt us, intentionally or unintentionally. We all have scars. We all bear the marks of the trauma that we have endured because we live in a broken world, filled with people who are just as broken as we are. And as those broken lives begin to collide into one another, it is nearly inevitable that some of those collisions will bring trauma, will bring pain, that some of those collisions will leave a mark. Some of those traumas will scar us. But in a world that is broken by human sin and rebellion, the good news is that God came and took on himself the worst that a broken world could do. Centuries before Jesus lived, there was a prophet by the name of Isaiah. And Isaiah had a series of visions about a redemptive figure who would take on the sin, the iniquity, the brokenness of humanity. And Isaiah referred to this figure as the servant of the Lord. Listen to how Isaiah describes this servant in Isaiah 53, starting in verse 3. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows, familiar with suffering. Like one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. And surely he took up our infirmities, he carried our sorrows, yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him. And by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. We have all, like sheep, gone astray. We have rebelled against the kingship of God. You go, well, I don't think I've ever done that. Every time that we believe, every time we believe that we know better how life should be lived than the creator of life, we are rebelling against the kingship of God. Every time we know what it is to do right and choose not to do it, we are rebelling against the kingship of God. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. But what Isaiah foresaw, what the New Testament declares, is that God laid on Jesus, his one and only sinless Son, the iniquity, the rebellion, the sin of us all. And by his wounds, by his scars, we are healed. Invite the band to come back. There is no one in this room, no one watching online who does not have scars. Because scars mark our present reality by our past experiences. And we all have past experiences that have wounded us, that have brought trauma, that have left us in pain. The body can heal, but it doesn't easily forget. And as Thomas saw that week after the first Easter, Jesus has scars of his own. Scars that mark trauma beyond what most of us could ever begin to imagine. The visible scars of the crucifixion. Nail holes in his hands and feet. A spear thrust in his side. A brow tattered by a crown of thorns. But I think it's probably safe to say that Jesus also knows what it is to have scars that aren't visible. To carry the weight and the hurt comes with being rejected by the very ones he came to save. When we encounter the scars of Jesus, it leaves us with a choice to make, with a decision, whether or not we will trust those scars to be evidence that He is who He says He is, Son of God, and whether we will trust His scars to heal our own. Our scars tend to be destructive. Jesus's are redemptive. And He longs to heal what hurts you. Here's the thing we've got to understand as we explore this conversation, guys. That doesn't mean all the scars go away. But it does change the story that they can tell. Let's pray together.